Room 307. Chapter 9. The Invitation. 3:37 a.m. The receptionist stood frozen in the center of the lobby, his hand still outstretched towards Ethan, who remained rooted to the spot with the brass key clenched tightly in his fist. Around them, the fire continued burning with quiet determination. The leather-bound register lay open upon the reception desk, and the name Ethan Carter remained written beside Room 307 in ink that still glistened beneath the lights, as though it had only just been written. Nobody questioned what they had seen. By now, they had reached the point where disbelief required more effort than acceptance. "You said it thinks I've accepted the invitation," Ethan said at last. "What exactly does that mean?" The receptionist lowered his hand slowly, his eyes never leaving the key. "It means," he replied carefully, "that something inside this hotel believes you have agreed to meet it." "I haven't agreed to anything." "You picked up the key. You told me not to leave it on the lift floor." "No," the receptionist replied quietly. "I never said that." Ethan replayed the conversation in his head. The receptionist had warned him not to touch the guest register. He had explained that room 307 was reserved. He had admitted recognizing the key, but he had never once told Ethan to leave it where it was. The realization tightened something in Ethan's chest. "So I was supposed to ignore it?" "I was hoping you would." Liam let out an exasperated sigh. "Forgive me if I'm missing something, but how was he supposed to know that picking up an old key was somehow entering into a supernatural contract?" The receptionist almost smiled. "He wasn't." "Well, that's a ridiculous system." "I agree." "You agree?" "I've never thought it was particularly fair." The sincerity in his answer left Liam momentarily speechless. Sophie walked slowly around the reception desk until she stood beside the open register. She studied Ethan's name for several moments before reaching into the pocket of her cardigan and removing a folded tissue. "I'm going to see if the ink smudges." "Don't." The receptionist spoke with surprising sharpness. Everyone looked at him. He immediately softened his voice. "I'm sorry." "You don't want me touching it?" "No." "Why?" "Because it may decide you've accepted as well." The lobby fell silent again. Sophie carefully returned the tissue to her pocket without taking her eyes off the page. "You keep talking about it as though it's alive." The receptionist didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked towards the staircase leading to the upper floors. Finally, he replied, "I've worked here for a very long time." "How long?" Ethan asked. "I honestly couldn't tell you." "You don't know how long you've worked here?" "I remember arriving." He smiled sadly. "I don't remember ever leaving." Nobody spoke. Daniel stared at him. "You're joking." "I wish I were." Margaret slowly lowered herself into one of the leather armchairs near the fireplace. She suddenly looked exhausted, as though the last hour had aged her considerably. Ethan noticed that her hands were trembling slightly, and Sophie immediately crossed the room to check on her. "Are you all right?" Margaret nodded. "I'm just tired." "You've gone very pale." "I know." "Would you like some water?" Margaret smiled faintly. "That would be lovely." Sophie disappeared briefly towards the restaurant in search of bottled water, leaving the others standing in uneasy silence. Ethan watched the fire for several moments before speaking again. "When I first arrived here," he said, "the receptionist told me that if the telephone in my room rang during the night, I should answer it." He looked directly at the receptionist. "Why?" The receptionist seemed genuinely uncomfortable. "Because if you don't answer—" He stopped. "What happens?" Liam asked. The receptionist looked into the flames. "It keeps ringing." Daniel frowned. "That's it?" "No." The receptionist's voice dropped almost to a whisper. It keeps ringing until somebody else answers instead. A cold silence settled over the lobby. Nobody needed him to explain further. Somehow, that possibility felt far worse. Sophie returned carrying 2 unopened bottles of water she had found inside a refrigerator behind the restaurant bar. She handed one to Margaret before unscrewing the other for herself. "The electricity still works," she observed. "The refrigerators are running. The heating's working too," Liam added. "The fire hasn't gone out. The lights are on." Daniel looked around the lobby. "So the hotel's functioning perfectly." "Exactly," Sophie replied. "But where is everybody?" It was a question none of them had asked properly until now. Earlier that evening, the dining room had been busy. There had been waiting staff, kitchen staff, housekeeping, other receptionists, guests chatting over coffee, people walking through the lobby. Now, they had vanished. Not disappeared dramatically, simply ceased to exist. The hotel had quietly emptied itself around them. Ethan's thoughts returned to the photograph on the wall. The man in the picture. Margaret looked up. "The one looking at the black window?" "Yes." "You recognized him?" "I still think I do." The receptionist followed the conversation carefully. "Which photograph?" "The one from the 1960s. A flicker of concern crossed his face. "You shouldn't keep looking at that photograph." "You've already said that." "Because it's true." Ethan walked back towards the framed picture. The others followed. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Liam frowned. "I'm not imagining this." "What?" Ethan asked. "The cars. What about them?" "They're different." Daniel stepped closer. "They weren't parked like that." "No. They've moved." Ethan studied the image carefully. Liam was right. Earlier, one of the vintage cars had been parked beside the front entrance. Now it stood much closer to the driveway. Another had disappeared altogether. The people remained exactly where they had been. Only the vehicles had changed. Sophie looked around the lobby. Nobody touched the picture. No, it changed. Margaret suddenly pointed towards the group of people standing outside the hotel. The man. Everyone looked. The concerned man was gone. His place now stood empty. Only a narrow gap remained between 2 smiling families. Nobody had noticed him leaving. Because, of course, he couldn't have. The receptionist quietly closed his eyes. It started. "What has?" Ethan asked. "The hotel is correcting itself." "What does that mean?" "It removes things that no longer belong." Liam frowned. "That sentence makes absolutely no sense." "It will." "When?" The receptionist looked at Ethan. "Soon." A loud metallic bang echoed from somewhere high above them. This time it wasn't a door. It sounded much heavier, almost like an old lift gate slamming shut. A second later came another sound, the unmistakable hum of machinery beginning to move. Everyone instinctively looked towards the lift corridor. The floor indicator above the doors remained dark. No number. No light. Nothing. Yet the sound continued. Whatever was moving wasn't this lift. The humming grew louder for several seconds before settling into a steady rhythm somewhere inside the walls. Ethan frowned. "How many lifts does this hotel have?" "One," the receptionist replied. "So what's making that noise?" The receptionist didn't answer. He simply looked upwards. Very slowly, everyone else did the same. The ceiling remained perfectly still. Cream plaster. Decorative molding. Nothing unusual. Then Chloe quietly reached for Daniel's arm. Listen. At first, Ethan heard nothing beyond the machinery. Then, beneath it, came another sound. Soft. Rhythmic. Like dozens of people speaking at once from somewhere impossibly far away. Not shouting. Not singing. Simply talking. The words couldn't quite be understood. They blended together into a constant murmur that seemed to drift through the ceiling itself. Margaret's expression changed instantly. I've heard that before. Everyone turned. When? She looked frightened. When I stayed here. Ethan stared at her. You've stayed at Alder House before? Margaret nodded slowly. 32 years ago. The lobby fell completely silent. Nobody had known. Not even Ethan. Margaret looked towards the staircase, with tears beginning to gather in her eyes. I didn't remember until just now. Her voice trembled. I wasn't here for a holiday. She swallowed hard. I came looking for my younger brother. No one interrupted. He disappeared from this hotel. The words hung in the air like another impossible revelation. Margaret closed her eyes. I think... She struggled to steady her breathing. I think his room was 307.